All right, getting into 1980s, 1990s America. We'll start with President Reagan. I'd like to forewarn you right now as we begin this. I haven't exactly been kind to American presidents through this class. I'm sure you've noticed that not too many of them I think have been all that good at presidents. And it's only going to get worse because I think, honestly, since Nixon all the way through now, we really haven't had a good president. So I'm going to be pretty aggressive against all of them, both Democrats and Republicans. Some of that's opinion and some of that is just looking at the facts. Today we start with Reagan, or right now we start with Reagan, depending, because you might see me do, or you might watch multiple of these, but this will probably be a two-parter. Then we'll move on to the first President Bush and President Clinton, then the second President Bush and President Obama. There will not be a Trump PowerPoint because it's really hard to do any real actual historical judging or historical looking back at presidents if they're still in office, right? So we can't really look back, but we can start to look back at some Obama era stuff, so that's where we will get to. So without further ado, Ronald Wilson Reagan, our 40th president. There he is right there, old Ronnie. So, his background, born in Illinois, was an actor and a Democrat. His parents were New Deal Democrats. They loved FDR. Ronald Reagan, for his entire political career, will try to destroy a lot of stuff that FDR put into place. He became the head of the Screen Actors Guild during the Red Scare. So, Screen Actors Guild is the big actors union. Reagan was an actor. Okay, he wasn't a particularly big guy. He wasn't like a Brad Pitt or whatever. It wasn't like an A-lister. Most people call him a B or a C-lister. But he was, a known actor who got into conservative politics. When he is the head of the Screen Actors Guild, he will be called in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he will throw a whole bunch of people under the bus, claim that they might be communists, not really protect them or anything like that, which in my opinion isn't very cool. If we look back and we remember those days, millions of Americans got investigated, and very, very few of them ever actually turned out to be communists or anti-American or anything. Just a lot of people had their lives ruined, and Reagan kind of aided in that. He became the governor of California in the year 1967. He'll be the governor until 1975. He runs in 76 to become the Republican nominee for president, and he loses that primary to Gerald Ford. A lot of people will say that does a lot of damage to Gerald Ford, but I think Ford probably would have lost to Carter no matter what. However, Reagan, at this point, is the standard bearer. He's the face of the Republican Party, so he runs and wins the nomination in 1980 and wins the presidency. Carter didn't have much of a chance with the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Iran hostage crisis. Yep, that wasn't even close. The Iran hostage crisis. And the economy wasn't very good. Gas prices and the OPEC wars and all that sort of stuff really hurt Carter, which opened it up for a landslide win here by Reagan. This is about as big of a landslide as you see in presidential elections against someone who was already president, right? So Carter was what we call the incumbent. He was running for re-election, and he got destroyed here by Reagan. Sort of similar to when FDR beat up Hoover in the Great Depression. That wasn't a very close one, about the same as this. So, as soon as he gets elected, someone tries to kill him. Assassination attempt here on Reagan. Okay, March 30th of 1981, him and his press secretary, James Brady, were shot by a man by the name of John Hinckley Jr. John Hinckley Jr. was legitimately insane. Okay, he was obsessed with this actress named Jodie Foster. She's still around. She does acting still. He was convinced there's a specific type of mental disorder, and I don't know the exact name, where you think, or you fall in love with someone prominent or famous, and you think if they just knew that you existed, they'd fall in love with you too. And that's basically how he felt about Jodie Foster. He thought if Jodie finds out that I exist, she'll fall in love with me and we'll be happy forever. So how is he going to become famous? Decides he's going to kill the president. Okay? It didn't matter which president. He actually stalked President Carter and tried to find an opportunity to shoot him, but never got a good chance. Found a good chance to shoot Reagan, and he does, right? So he shoots Reagan in the chest. Luckily for Reagan, the bullet hit his rib and stopped, right? Or else he probably would have died. Brady was shot in the head. Okay, James Brady was debilitated for years. Obviously, as you would guess, getting shot in the head isn't very good, but he does survive. Okay? Hinckley will go on trial and will be found not guilty because he was obviously insane. So what they did was put him in a mental hospital full-time until the year 2006. So for 25 years, he was in a mental hospital. He couldn't leave. Now the bell's gone. He's going to have visitors and stuff like that all the way until 2006. Okay. Then from 2006 until 2016, he was in that hospital part-time and was able to go home sometimes to be with his mother. And then he was released under his mother's supervision, and he has mandatory, I don't know how often, but he has to have psychiatric evaluations. Okay. What happens with Reagan, which often happens with presidents after there's attempts at their lives, his popularity is going to increase considerably. Right? So, moving on to some pictures. So there's Reagan walking out of, he gave a speech somewhere, and then Hinckley Jr. sprints up and shoots him, and you can see here Reagan being sort of, he got shot, so he's coming down to the ground, but the Secret Service will jump on him and pull him down, jump over his body in case the guy's going to shoot more, so that they will, of course, take the bullet for the president. Then they jump into that car right there that was waiting, and they took him straight to the hospital. But he will survive. Okay, got a lot of get well soon cards. President, or soon to be, George, the first Bush president, was Reagan's vice president, so he'll run the country a little bit until Reagan's out of surgery and recovered a bit, and then Reagan resumes control. So true or false? True or false? The assassination attempt increased Reagan's popularity. Here's some pictures of John Hinckley Jr., the shooter, the assassin, attempted assassin. So true or false? Reagan's assassin was found guilty and he was put to death. Right? You shoot a president, you get shot yourself. Is this true? Is this false? All right, now moving into Reagan's domestic policy, and this will be probably the most important part of his presidency. He gets a lot of credit for Cold War politics and some military buildup and something like this, but I think this is more important. So, Reagan believed in something called trickle-down economics. We've talked about trickle-down economics before, all the way back with Hoover in the Great Depression, where we cut taxes for rich people, right? We make sure that the wealthy, the people at the very top of our economy, that they have lower taxes, because eventually they will send that money down to us regular folk. They'll either pay us more at our jobs, or they'll open up more factories, or whatever. Okay? This didn't work in the 20s, and spoiler alert, it did not work in the 80s. However, I will say that the Republican Party is still completely in love with Reaganomics, with trickle-down economics, and I would argue that the Democratic Party is pretty in love with it too. Because both, let's see here, we never increased taxes on the rich under Clinton, and not really under Obama either, so they're pretty well wedded to this. An aside here, a quick tangent. The reason why both parties love or are kind of into this is that Reagan was a very good politician. He was very popular for the most part. Once we get into a second term especially, he'll be very popular. He completely revitalizes the Republican Party. And because he was so good at campaigning, Democrats decided that they should be more like him too, which we will see as we talk more about Clinton and some about Obama later on in this unit. So, anyways. So we're going to cut taxes, back to Reaganomics. Okay, so it's part trickle down, it's part what we call supply side economics. But we're going to cut taxes, and the wealth will trickle down. Government, and then this is a big part here at the end. He said that government revenue would increase even though we're accepting less taxes, which is sort of ludicrous, right? How does a government run itself? A government runs itself off of taxes, right? So how is the revenue going to go up? Anyways, they passed the Economic Recovery Act, which was a 25% tax cut spread over 3 years. These taxes, the biggest cut is for rich people, okay? And even if we cut taxes the same for poor people and rich people, obviously rich people get a bigger benefit because they have less money that they have to spend in tax money. There's been a very big debate. It didn't start with Reagan. It started with other politicians about whether or not we should tax people anymore at all, even at times. Up until that point, it had been patriotic, where rich Americans saw it as part of their patriotic duty to pay more in taxes because they benefited more from American society, and now they're running from that idea. Anyways, another big part of the Reagan domestic policy that other presidents have followed will be to cut social spending while increasing defense spending. What that means is cutting programs that help people here in America, like cutting the Head Start program, which allowed poor kids to go to preschool and kindergarten and give them a head start into school, or cutting welfare payments, or cutting food assistance, or cutting Medicare and Medicaid, and that way you can spend more money on defense and military spending. Okay? Reagan will be huge on this. Okay? You know who else will be huge on this? President Bush, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama. Basically everyone's followed that pattern. When a Democrat's in charge, they cut a little bit less in social spending, or at least Obama did. Clinton's cut more than anybody ever has. And then they always increase defense spending. Always, 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 always. Okay? So what does this end up in? We tripled our national debt. Okay? President Reagan was not fiscally conservative, right? He tripled our national debt. We went from $1 trillion to $3 trillion. Okay? In fact, they had to raise taxes in 1984 to try and make up the deficit. And for the first time since World War I, the United States became a debtor nation. What that means is we started borrowing money from other countries. Starting in the Reagan administration, we still do. We like to freak out about it every once in a while. The national debt is like $23 trillion right now. We weren't a debtor nation. We didn't have any debt. We were loaning out money to people. We're still the world's bank at that point. And now we are not, right? And that starts in the 80s. Our trade deficit, which means how much more we import than export, went from $59 billion to $159 billion by 1983. However, economic recession will begin to improve in broad numbers by 1984. So unemployment goes down from about 12% at the height of stagflation down to 8%. Inflation goes down from about 10% to 4%. So those are some big numbers that get better, right? That doesn't mean that all that goes to makes everybody's life better, but some things get better. Now, deregulation is going to be another huge part of the Reagan administration, and it's basically probably the biggest thing in Republican politics still to this day, in conservative politics, that we need to deregulate things more. That regulation is going to ruin us or something, right? So he will deregulate AT&T, the airline, trucking, and savings and loan industries. Deregulating the savings and loan industry was a super big mistake. Okay, I do want to point out that Reagan wasn't the first person to start deregulating. Carter did a lot of it himself too. But when we deregulated savings and loans, basically what we allowed them to do was do more risky stuff, right? Instead of saying this is exactly what you can do, you can't play with people's money in this way, we kind of just let them do it again. So what happens? They begin issuing riskier loans, which they could make more money off of by charging higher interest. Those loans will be defaulted because people couldn't afford to pay those loans. And it results in the bank industry asking us for a bailout, which we gave them. $500 million to bail out the savings and loan industry, failing banks, in 1989. Okay, so us taxpayers had to cover the bill because we allowed banks, or I should say our political leaders allowed banks to do risky, stupid things. They did those risky, stupid things. People couldn't keep up with their payments, and now the banking industry is going to collapse. And instead of making them reform, we just give them $500 million. And why do I say we didn't really reform it? Well, because 20 years later, in 2008, banks are going to default because they gave out risky loans with huge interest payments, and we had to bail them out to the tune of $500 billion. So obviously we didn't learn from that mistake. One other big thing he will do, air traffic controllers went on strike. They formed a huge union. They went on strike because they did not have the pay that they wanted. They didn't have the benefits that they wanted. Air traffic controlling is a particularly stressful job, so I can understand that a little bit. And he fired all of them. He said, air traffic is of national security, and since I'm in charge of national security, I will fire all of you, right? And he did. So there he is pointing to some random chart about Reaganomics. Okay, we call his economic policy Reaganomics. There he is making it work. Even his own vice president, George W. Bush, called it voodoo economics, but it was popular, and Reagan was popular, so they kept with it. So how much did the national debt increase during Reaganomics? A, it went down. B, it stayed the same. C, it doubled. D, it tripled. Back-to-back questions. Deregulation helped lead to the massive savings and loan crisis of 1988-1989. How much did American taxpayers have to pay for that bailout? 100 billion, 300 billion, 500 billion, or 1 trillion. Those numbers should be millions or trillions, so I messed that up. So A should be 100 million, B should be 300 million, C should be 500 million, and D should be 1 billion. Right? That's a mistake. It'll be right on your quiz. All right, more Reaganomics stuff. Okay, Tax Reform Act of 1986 further lowered taxes, supposedly removed tax shelters and credits, which has never happened, right? If you're rich, you can hide your money. It's really easy, and they do it all the time. So when I say they lowered taxes even further, at the end of, so in 1960, the end of the Republican Eisenhower administration, the top tax rate was 92%. So if you were super rich and you made $10 million, you got to keep all your $10 million, but every dollar after you got to $10 million, you had to pay 92 cents in taxes, right? By the end of the Reagan administration, the top tax rate went from 92% down to in the 40s, like 46%, I want to say. Right? So now the rich aren't paying that fair share of taxes compared to what us regular people are taxed at. So if you extrapolate it all the way out till now, the effective tax rate for us middle-class Americans is actually higher than it is for the top 1%. This starts, and it gets put on steroids here during the Reagan administration, but I will say that both Nixon and Carter did lower taxes on the rich too. All right, Black Monday, another stock market crash, 1987. Part of that was the savings and loan scandal kind of showing its way out, getting into the public lexicon, but we did have a big stock market crash in 87. Deregulation will lead to large-scale mergers and multinational corporations dominating the economy. So what that means is we used to have more regulations on whether or not companies could merge and become even bigger companies. The federal government has to approve huge mergers, right? AT&T and Sprint got approved to merge by the federal government. Those are two gigantic cell phone carriers. Why would the government want to say in that? Well, to theoretically stop monopolies from happening, right? But we will start in the 80s and all the way up until right now, through every presidency we've had, okaying a lot more gigantic mergers, right? Especially multinational mergers, because if an American company merges with a company, say, in Ireland, which basically charges no taxes to corporations, then they can relocate themselves to Ireland and avoid paying taxes in America almost entirely, which is going to happen a lot in the last 40 years. So Reagan's overall economic legacy will be mixed. Tax cuts plus increased military spending will create at least $200 billion in lost revenue per year of his presidency, which gets you to $1.6 trillion worth of lost revenue. Our national debt tripled. We become a debtor nation. It helps set up this very standard conservative argument for cutting social spending. Okay, so Reagan will cut taxes, which lowers the amount of money the government can spend, but he also spends more money on the military. So now we're in debt, and so he sets it up and says, hey, listen, we have to cut social programs. We gotta cut this Head Start. We gotta cut Medicare and Medicaid. We gotta cut these things because we're in debt and we have to be responsible, right? And the only responsible thing is to cut social spending, not cut anything else, right? It's a sacred cow, as they say. In America, we never talk about cutting the military budget because we have to increase military spending all the time. Both parties believe in that. So what can we cut? We can't raise taxes because raising taxes isn't very popular. You want to win elections. You can't win a lot of elections if you're raising taxes, so we got to cut something. Easy to cut social programs and mainly help the poor because both parties don't really care about the poor. So that's kind of where we're at. Trade deficits will not diminish until the Clinton presidency. He balances the budget during the Clinton presidency, but the big reason he does that is he destroys social programs. We'll talk about that with Clinton. I got plenty to yell at Clinton about too. Reagan's legacy economically will be controversial. Okay, conservatives still 100 million bazillion % believe that Reaganomics works completely. Liberals really don't think it works. However, when you get to electoral politics, you get to the highest levels, there has not been a liberal president, or I should say a Democratic president, that has really reversed Reaganomics that much. What this leads to is what we call a massive upwards distribution of wealth. This means is instead of wealth trickling down, wealth trickled up during the 80s. The top 1% got much, 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 much richer, while the rest of us didn't, creating a huge wealth gap. Okay? I'm going to show you a picture here in a second, a chart, and that's going to explain that a little bit. The economy will improve in broad strokes, okay? So unemployment and inflation go down, the GDP goes up, but it was not evenly shared. Regular people's lives did not get as much better as rich people's lives, not anywhere close. Okay, so when you see politicians, both parties do this all the time, right? They'll show a big number like unemployment or inflation or the stock market, and they'll say the economy's great, right? But that doesn't exactly correlate, and often doesn't correlate to take-home pay, benefits, working conditions, stuff like that us regular people have to worry about. Okay, but let's take a look at this chart, and you're going to get to see me because I got to pop in here and take a look at this. So this chart right here explains why I think that basically since the 80s, every president's been pretty bad. So this is all the money in the United States, right? All the average income growth, right? So the more money you make. The red bars are the rich, right? The top 10%. The blue bar is the bottom 90%, us regular people. So what this chart shows us is how the wealth was distributed. Who gets it? Regular people or the wealthy? The majority of us, 90% of us, or the minority, the rich 10%. So up through the Nixon, Carter, Ford years, it was pretty even, right? 55-45. 55% of all the wealth generated and income growth generated went to us regular people. Then we get to the Reagan administration, where 20% of all the income that was grown, right, went to us 90%. So us 90% got a share. 20% of all the money that gets raised. The other 80% went to the top 10%, those that were already rich. Okay? They got their tax cuts and they kept their money. They didn't share it with us. Deregulation helped lead to worse working conditions and lower benefit payments and stuff like that, and the rich just kept that money. Now let's get into, we'll show you this real quick so I can get angry again. Let's get to the Clinton presidency, all right? Supposedly liberal Clinton. It was only slightly better. It was 25-75, where the rich got 75% of all the money and the poor got 25%. Or I should say middle class and poor get 25%. Let's go to George Bush. 99-1. 99% of all of the average income growth during the George W. Bush years went to the top 10%. Only 1% to the rest of us. But not to be outdone, here we go to the Obama years, okay, the Great Recession and all that sort of stuff. More than 100%. 110% of wealth generated went to rich people, and the rest of us took a bath. We all lost money. That's why I think our presidents in the last 40 years have been mostly crap. Right there. Right there, right there, right there. They only care about rich people, not so much about us. Which is something that last election, President Trump talked about how things aren't getting better for the middle class. So did Bernie Sanders. They both had radically different ideas of how to address that. Trump basically followed the Reagan path and cut taxes on the rich more. And we'll see how that graph turns out here in a few years. Whew. Anyways, true or false? Deregulation led to large-scale mergers and multinational corporations dominating the economy. Is that true or is that false? All right, domestic policies. More stuff economy-wise, okay? Women and minorities. He'll name Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first female justice of the Supreme Court. That was a big headline-generating deal, but in the back end, he will appoint much fewer women and many less minorities than Carter to work in the federal government. He will be a president for 8 years, Reagan, and he'll appoint fewer women and fewer minorities than Carter did in 4 years. He will oppose the idea of equal pay for equal work. He will oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, and he opposed renewing the Voting Rights Act. So he did not think we needed to protect minority voters anymore. Did not think that women should have equal rights to men in a constitutional amendment. Now, he's not the only one to do that, but the Republican Party, by and large, was against the Equal Rights Amendment, and he opposed equal pay for equal work. The AIDS outbreak will be one of the worst moments in American political history, but it should be a huge black eye for Reagan, but it still isn't because we don't necessarily care what happens in the LGBT community yet, really at large, unfortunately, I should say. So, AIDS, the first reported AIDS case in America was in 1981. Okay, the Reagan administration didn't respond to it, right? There was silence. They didn't want to talk about it. The big reason for this is that homophobia was much, much, much worse in the 1980s. Okay, being gay was still not socially acceptable in all of America, basically in the 1980s. That has gotten more and more and more and more accepted as the years go. But at this point in the 80s, it was not acceptable at all. People still were blacklisted from the government or from prominent jobs if it was found out that they might be gay. So, a large part of Reagan's voting bloc was homophobic and thought that AIDS was God's revenge on gay men. And you might ask, why do I have that in quotes? Well, because Reagan's communication director, Pat Buchanan, said that on the record, that AIDS was God's revenge on gay men. Right? The spokesperson for the Reagan administration said that. And AIDS mostly affected the gay community. So they didn't want to address it at all. Right? Eventually, they will have to. He will publicly address the AIDS epidemic in 1987, right? So 6 years after it happens, the outbreak starts. At this point, 20,849 Americans at least had died from AIDS before the president addressed it, right? So we're in the middle of this coronavirus pandemic, right? At this moment, I'm speaking to you, at least 58,000 Americans have died. Everybody looks back to the 1918 Spanish flu for the last big epidemic where lots and lots of Americans died and the government response wasn't as good as it could be. But they always skip over this one, right? 21,000 dead Americans before the government makes any semblance of trying to help. At this point, Americans, so here's some protesters right here. This will be a huge moment in the 80s for the LGBT community to start protesting more prominently and more openly. At this point, most people, if they got AIDS, were resorting to, going to Canada or going to Mexico to buy drugs, buy prescription drugs that they couldn't get here in America, and trying to make up their own drug cocktails to survive, which, as you can guess, wasn't the most effective way to treat this crisis. So, at least how many Americans died before the Reagan administration addressed the AIDS outbreak? Was it 5, 10, 15, or 20,000 people? An aside to this, right, we know Dr. Fauci now because he's on TV all the time as he's part of the coronavirus response team. He made his mark, actually, trying to address the AIDS crisis. And it's awesome to note now that most people that get AIDS live basically normal lives, that our the drugs that we give have improved so much that people can generally live a normal, healthy life here in America, of course, if they have insurance, if they have AIDS. All right, more domestic policy. He signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. This will be the latest really, really big immigration reform, but it's the second newest immigration reform, and it's been 34 years. So this escalated penalties for hiring undocumented workers and it increased Immigration and Naturalization Service funding to enforce the law. What it also did was it granted amnesty to resident aliens who had been in the United States continually since 1982. So that gave 3 million undocumented workers or undocumented immigrants, gave them American residency, and then eventually they could apply for citizenship. So that's 3 million people. That's basically where immigration reform packages break down right now. We have somewhere around 12 million undocumented immigrants right now. And generally, when they start to debate immigration reform, there's always a question of amnesty, and then things break down. Also, during Reagan's presidency, we had the Challenger explosion. On January 28th of 1986, the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger explodes shortly after takeoff. Now, this obviously wasn't Reagan's fault, but it happens under his presidency. It's a pretty notable thing, so we talk about it. 7 astronauts, including 1 teacher, were killed. Okay, a teacher won a contest to be an astronaut. She went through all the training, and then the Challenger explodes. This will damage NASA's credibility big time because it was on international television while this happens. It happens live. Everybody watches as it happens. Here's a quick quote from Reagan. Okay, I supported this bill on the immigration reform. He says, I supported this bill. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and who have lived here even though some time back they may have entered illegally. So we can base off of this that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have moved to the right of Reagan in a lot of ways on immigration. All right, so part of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 was the allowance of people who had once entered illegally to stay, what we call an amnesty. So how many people were affected by the amnesty? 1 million, 3 million, 5 million, or 10 million? All right, there's the Challenger exploding. It happens right there on national television. Those are the 7 astronauts, including 1 teacher, who died in the explosion. All right, the war on drugs will be another black mark on our political life here in America. So the war on drugs was not started by Reagan, okay? But Reagan will put it on steroids. And the war on drugs, if I may say, right now, it might just be my opinion, but as we go through the numbers right here, we'll see if you agree with mine or not, but the war on drugs has been an absolute failure in the United States of America, okay? We have more people doing more drugs and more people locked up for doing drugs than ever before, and it just keeps increasing. Right now, you tell me if that's a win, if more people are using drugs when we're supposed to be stopping that, right? But we'll get into that here more in a second. So, Nixon formally started the war on drugs. Reagan will put more and more money into it, more than $1.7 billion. And so how does the war on drugs work? Because you'll hear people talk about the war on drugs. Basically, it works by increasing federal control over local police forces and local prosecutions. What they did is the government said, Washington says, we will give you more money, we'll give you more equipment if you arrest more make more drug arrests, right? Possession or dealers, right? Arrest them. Arrest more and more of them. If we keep arresting them all the time, you'll get more money, you'll get more equipment, and we'll get rid of drugs, right? What doesn't get taken down are the big kingpins, right? Just low-level dealers and addicts that get arrested while they're possessing. So the prison industry is going to explode. We have to build thousands of more jails to hold the people that we are arresting. The prison population obviously explodes, mostly full of black or brown people, right? There were only 41,000 people in jail for drug crimes in 1980. By 2014, that went from 41,000 to 488,000. Despite the fact that all races use and sell drugs at roughly the same rate, black people are 3.6 times more likely to get arrested for selling drugs and 2.5 times more likely to get arrested for possession. Black and brown people are also significantly more likely to be charged with a federal drug crime when compared to white Americans. Okay? This is not in dispute, right? These are the raw numbers. If you look at it, white people use drugs just as much as black or brown people, but they don't get arrested for it the same. What I will say, the most obvious example of this is the difference in criminal penalties for if you use crack cocaine or powdered cocaine. Crack cocaine generally used by black and brown people, powdered cocaine used by white people generally. They're the exact same thing. They're both illegal drugs. But crack cocaine has a mandatory minimum penalty, multiple years in prison, whereas powder cocaine does not. That's where we get the argument, that's where lots of people will give the argument that the war on drugs was disproportionately bad for minorities in America. So part of the war on drugs will be mandatory minimums, 3 strike laws. If you get arrested for 3 different felonies and all drug crimes basically become felonies, you go to jail forever. So we have people in prison forever for getting caught selling marijuana 3 times. There are limitations on housing, voting, social programs that add to the disproportionately negative effects on minority communities. Clinton will be especially bad on this, where if you get drug crimes, you have a drug felony on your record, you cannot get any help for housing. Many states will strip you from voting, and you won't have any access to social programs like food benefits, SNAP, or welfare, or WIC, because you had 1 drug penalty on your record. Like I said, the war on drugs has been an absolute failure. We spent nearly $1 trillion now. We've locked up hundreds of thousands of people, and yet there are more drugs on the street now than in 1974 when we started the war. A couple of really good things. Read the new Jim Crow, that talks about it a lot, or watch 13th on Netflix. They talk about the war on drugs a lot. So this question will be the end of part 1. The war on drugs, ... A, led to a huge increase in the prison population. B, caused the prison industry to explode. C, has disproportionately affected people of color. D, has been a failure. Or E, all of the above. All right, that's it for part 1. I'll be back momentarily for part 2.